Good morning, and thank you for coming this morning for the Green Party's release of the amendments that we'll be presenting it clause by clause on Bill C-51. Je suis Elizabeth May, chef de parti vert. Avec moi, c'est mon chef adjoint, Bruce Hyer, député de Thunder Bay Superior Nord. The process of trying to fix this bill is actually mission impossible, but it is important to make substantive, thoughtful amendments where possible. I just want to set a bit of a context, and I'll turn the floor to Bruce to describe his amendments, and I'll come back to finish describing mine. When Stephen Harper launched this bill, as you'll recall, it was not launched in Parliament. It was launched at a campaign-style rally in Richmond Hill, Ontario, in which the Prime Minister said, and I quote, "Violent jihadism is not a human right. It is an act of war," unquote. Well, I don't think anyone had ever suggested violent jihadism is a human right, nor is it an act of war. And I think it's very important to keep clear lines between these drumbeats of war, the ISIL vote later tonight as well, and what really is the truth about Canada. We are not a country at war. We are a country in peacetime. We're still one of the safest places in the world to live. That said, we need to keep Canadians safe from threats from roving criminal gangs, criminals who have an ideological goal, any form of violence. It's important to keep our perspective and keep Canadians safe. But as Professors Forsese and Roach pointed out, quote, "False analogies between crime and war can contort law." This bill is rife with false analogies between crime and war, and it is extremely bad law. It's in 5 parts, 5 separate bills. It's therefore an omnibus bill. Between Bruce Hyer and myself, we will be tabling it clause by clause on Tuesday, 60 amendments. They're substantive, they're serious. I want to ask Bruce, just for sake of the flow of the press conference, to speak to the amendments to Part 2 of the Act, and I'll come back to cover Parts 1, 3, 4, and 5.
My mission impossible is to try to fix the part of C-51 having to do with no-fly lists and airplanes and air companies. To give you the broad picture first, there's simply no oversight, and there's very poor drafting in this part of the legislation. So I'm introducing 15 amendments to try to improve those things. Some of the specific problems are there's an undue burden on airlines. Apparently, the airlines were not even really consulted on this, and they actually gave us some suggestions on how to improve it that we've incorporated into our amendments. Due process is in jeopardy. This is not something new with the Harper government, but it's very clear in this act that that's a problem, and there's tremendous ministerial overreach in this bill. It really allows the minister to do things that no judge, no court, no police agency could ever do. So we are hopeful, even though virtually never do the Conservatives consider opposition amendments, we hope that this time they will make an exception to their ideological rule on this and consider these amendments that will improve the no-fly section of the bill. Back to you, Elizabeth.
Merci. Le premier parti de projet de loi C-51, c'est le projet de loi au sujet de un partage de renseignements sur la question de les menaces vers la sécurité du Canada. Et c'est vraiment bizarre. Il y a dans cette partie 1 un changement radical à la définition de menace. So in this section that deals with threats to the security of Canadians and then shares information, our amendment number 1 gets rid of the really bizarre, obscure, and almost infinite set of activities of Canadians that could constitute a threat to the security of Canada. Our amendments use the definition of threat to the security of Canada found in the CSIS Act. Everybody knows what it means. It has boggled the mind of every witness that I've heard before the committee that they have put forward this new definition. And by the way, this is one of the sections where the government amendments that we learned of on Friday does change something. So I have an amendment that will be redundant to one part of what the government did, which is to remove the word lawful in front of advocacy, protest, dissent, and artistic expression. The same change was made back in 2001 when the Liberals first introduced anti-terror legislation after 9/11. The same mistake was made of deciding to modify dissent with the word lawful, and McClellan relented, and now after Stephen Blaney, Peter MacKay, and Stephen Harper pretending they didn't understand my question in question period, they seem to have finally understood the question and they're taking out the word lawful. But there's still a lot that is egregious in this section. I doubt that it would pass muster with the Privacy Commissioner, but we won't know because he wasn't allowed to testify then. I'm hoping he'll explain through the media what he thinks of the small changes. They're not sufficient to change the overwhelming problem with the Security to Canada section, the bad definition coupled with broad powers for sharing information. Part 3 of the Act is the one that deals with what I now call thought chill. Part 3 is supposed to be about stopping the use of terrorism propaganda on the internet. The definitions of terrorism here are also extremely overbroad and refer to something unknown in law called terrorism in general. In order to fix this, we've had to tighten up the definition of what terrorism means, and we've created a specific carve-out. And this is important because Stephen Harper wants Canadians to think he's trying to keep us safe, and opposition party members like me or Mr. Mulcair, or 4 former prime ministers and 5 former Supreme Court judges don't seem to care as much about keeping us safe. The reality is this bill will make us less safe, and this is one of those provisions which will make us less safe, in that by leaving out an exclusion for private conversations, bearing in mind that if the section on propaganda and terrorism is like anything else we already have in law, it is like hate speech laws, and it's like child pornography laws. But unlike those 2 classes of censorship on the internet for public purpose, this section has no statutory defenses, and it also does not exclude private conversations. That makes it rather a large threat of having, for instance, someone who's trying to speak to an increasingly radicalized member of a mosque and convince them that what they want to do is a big mistake could fall under the ambit of this kind of communicating statements, knowingly advocating commission, or knowing that it might be committed, whether those offenses will be committed. The language is so vague that you would be at significant risk to enter into conversations to stop somebody from being radicalized. This is a really big flaw. Part 4, and I'm skipping over the rest of my amendments to Part 3. Part 4 is the creation of the CSIS secret police. And this is the section which is the most dangerous, because the activities of a secret police will rarely connect themselves in a way that allows them to go to court to be challenged there. It's a really significant point. Almost everything else in this bill is going to eventually end up before the courts and go to the Supreme Court, and the bad parts will be judged unconstitutional. But this section, which is a permission for constitutional breach, it says to CSIS agents, you can go to a judge and get permission to violate the charter. This is unheard of. And the CSIS agents themselves are not expected to tell the RCMP what they're doing. So we have put in an amendment that will say, all right, we can't change the whole law through amendments, right? We have to stay within the purpose of the law. So in our amendment, we say, look, if CSIS agents are going to go take covert actions, they must tell the RCMP what they're doing. There is nothing in this bill that creates any oversight or communication between the various security anti-terrorism groups, between the Canadian Border Services, CSEC, CSIS, or the RCMP. There's no communication required between these entities. And former Justice John Major, who oversaw the Air India inquiry, testified to the committee that in his experience, these different agencies develop their own sense of, he said it's human nature. He didn't quite explain what he thought was wrong with human nature, but he thought they would not share. Their inclination will be to withhold and set in place the kind of lack of coordination that led to the Air India disaster, which was the single largest act of terrorism on Canadian soil ever. This puts in place in concrete the mistakes that Justice Major said we should never make. Part 5 is immigration and refugee law. We're trying to fix a section, and unfortunately they had no witnesses respond to a question that I wanted to ask. No one asked the question. Is Section 54 about allowing a judge to be given information about a warrant tendered by a minister where the judge won't be told the information was obtained by torture? I was unable to ask any questions through this committee process, and that's unusual. Most committees, when I attend every single time, allow me to ask some questions sometime, not once this time. So we've fixed this in an amendment. I hope that my amendments will at least some of them, be accepted by the conservative majority in the Standing Committee on Public Safety. My time's up, so I'll be very happy to take, and Bruce and I will take any questions you might have.
Any progress at all that the amendments that, I guess, leaked out on Friday? I mean, are they a step in the right direction?
It's very significant that this bill has received a handful, fewer than a handful, of government amendments. The last time this happened was on the so-called Fair Elections Act. So is it encouraging? It's encouraging that public pressure is working. It's proof that while they didn't listen to witnesses, they're watching the polls. They're watching if support for this bad bill slip away from under their feet. And they have conservative voices, people like Rex Murphy and Conrad Black and the board of the National Post saying this is bad legislation. So when Stephen Harper decides that any product of PMO is less than 100% perfection, that's progress. But do those amendments satisfy my concerns that this is dangerous legislation? No.
If you could only choose one substantial amendment, what's the most important one that you want to see?
Withdraw the bill, but that's not an amendment. I think the most important thing. I mean, I still hope the bill can be defeated. I call on Liberal MPs to vote against this bill. Let your Conservative colleagues know you're considering voting against this bill if the Liberal amendments aren't accepted, because there are Conservative MPs who don't want to vote for this bill, but they're not going to put themselves out on a limb and vote against a bill if they know the Liberals are voting for it. So I still hope that in the time we have between clause by clause, which I'm sure you know the schedule, we're going to be running pretty much all day tomorrow and have a fallback to continue on Wednesday for however long it takes. So we will not, I don't think the bill will be through third reading before the Easter break. So we have time to continue the pressure. And that's one message to Canadians who fought this, who organized 70 rallies on March 14th as a day of action against C-51. Keep it up. Keep up the pressure, because maybe we can get the Liberals to shift their vote, and then we'll see some Conservative MPs, I believe, will vote with us to stop this, because it's really bad legislation. But my one amendment, I think, to keep this from being a schmozzle, where CSIS agents are spying on RCMP informants and vice versa, and no one knows what anyone's doing, I'd like to see my amendment that CSIS operatives have to tell the RCMP what they're doing first.
Justement là-dessus, qu'est-ce que ça changerait que les agents du SCRS disent à la GRC ce qu'ils vont faire?
Oui, c'est seulement pour protéger les efforts de GRC, puis aussi de CIS. C'est pour moi, c'est une question des experts sécuritaires, a dit qu'avec l'approche de C-51, la sécurité du Canada, des Canadiens et Canadiennes est plus menacée que sans ce projet de loi. Et la réalité, c'est qu'il n'y a aucune responsabilité, aucun mécanisme dans ce projet de loi pour un lien entre les communications entre les services d'intelligence, des policiers, contre le terrorisme. C'est vraiment possible, on peut imaginer très facilement les désastres comme le Keystone Cops, où le main gauche ne connaît pas que la main doit faire.
Plus précisément, parce que vous vous inquiétez d'une police politique instaurée par le SCRS, en quoi le fait de communiquer au préalable à la GRC réduit le risque de cette police secrète?
Pas du tout, pas du tout. Avec la question un seul amendement, c'est un peu peut-être un peu de surprise aussi pour moi que j'ai choisi un amendement pour le bon travail, la sécurité du Canada et pas pour la protection des libertés et droits et libertés. C'est pour moi, il y a les deux questions. M. Harper, son histoire, c'est que les Canadiens sont menacés par les terroristes et les critiques contre C-51, c'est seulement occupé avec la protection de charte de droits et libertés. Mais pour moi, c'est les deux choses. Ce projet de loi va rendre le système d'investigation contre le terrorisme plus faible. Et aussi, c'est vraiment un désastre pour les efforts d'arrêter les des terroristes ou les gens qui pensent que peut-être devenir terroristes. So it is strange for me to discover that when asked for only one amendment, I didn't pick one that protects Canadian rights and liberties. I picked one to make sure the police, the RCMP, knows what the secret police are up to. But obviously, for myself, it's so very deeply unconstitutional to allow a CSIS agent to go to a judge in a secret hearing to get a warrant, not just to break the law, but to violate the Constitution. This is deeply anti-democratic and absolutely unacceptable in a democracy.
Would they be violating?
Just about all of it. But the Charter of Rights and Freedoms to start with. I mean, the idea that you can have, and this is how Craig Forsese described it before committee, a warrant for constitutional breach. That's how we call it, quote unquote. A warrant. We can get a warrant for constitutional breach? In what universe, on what democracy? Nowhere else on earth, right? And this is insane. That you're going to say to a CSIS agent, okay, they've prescribed something CSIS agents must not do. And I'm sure you're familiar with them. They must not commit bodily harm. Oh, by the way, one of my amendments clarifies that not committing bodily harm includes things like waterboarding, like no torture, okay? Because right now that's not clear. You cannot commit bodily harm causing death or knowingly pervert the course of law. But I guess if you do it by accident, it's okay. Or violate the sexual integrity of a person. But on top of that, CSIS agents are told that they can break the law in Canada and overseas, and they can violate charter rights. But if they anticipate that they're about to violate charter rights, which I ask you is not the area of expertise of CSIS agents, the Minister of Justice quite often disagrees with the Supreme Court of Canada on what violates the charter. But CSIS agents are now supposed to know that. And if they're about to violate the charter, they go to one judge in a secret hearing to ask for a warrant to violate the charter. This is very strange law. And so the aspects of the Constitution that are breached, another one, of course, is Section 35 of the Constitution has been breached by this because there's been no prior consultation with First Nations. And that's a very fundamental point that National Chief Perry Bellegarde made to the committee, that since there had been no consultations with First Nations, and they believe that this imposes on their treaty rights and their constitutionally enshrined rights in Section 35 of the Constitution, it violates the Constitution in that way too. But that's how the bill violates it, not how CSIS agents violate it.
For Mr. Hyer to explain why this is a burden on airlines?
Do you want to go?
The airlines weren't consulted for start. They, unlike the USA, in the USA, if you're going to deny somebody access to a flight because you fear they're terrorists, a police officer comes to the gate and stops them. Here, it's up to the airline to do that. When the government decides somebody's on a no-fly list with rather dubious criteria or appeal mechanisms or oversight, the responsibility is on the airline. Another fascinating thing that's in this act that we're proposing amendments to is now if they suspect that one person on a plane is a terrorist, everyone on the airplane can have their cell phone, their computer, and their data confiscated without due cause. Very bizarre portions of this act, and the airlines I have it here, I can give it to you afterward. The airlines are very concerned about the responsibilities that are about to be thrust upon them without the resources and with really dubious rationale.
Yeah, if I could have one thing, sorry,
Sure.
Everything Bruce said is absolutely right. The two airline organizations testified to the committee. Both were furious. Unfortunately, the first one who testified was within enough time for us to capture their concerns, and they're in Bruce's amendments about taking away the requirement that the airlines are required by the minister to do anything the minister thinks they should do. Now, the government amendments that were tabled Friday also deal with this one piece, so that they can't tell the airlines they have to do anything the minister wants, because they found that unreasonable. Unfortunately, the second airline organization that testified was one of the last witnesses on one of the last panels on Thursday night, as we had this sort of, pushing witnesses through like meat through a meat grinder as fast as possible while nobody listens process. Well, the last witness from the airlines pointed something out, and to my shame, I missed it. What it does is it makes the airlines financially, at very steep fines, liable for any failures at the screening stage. And as the airlines pointed out to the committee late Thursday night, they don't do the screenings. CATSA does the screenings. and they don't like being made financially liable for something they don't control. Now, if I had our by the horrific coercive process PMO created for Bruce Hyer and me to present our amendments, we have to have them submitted to the committee by first thing Friday morning. So a witness late Thursday night, we can't accommodate their concern in our amendments. It was too late. But I'm really quite horrified that they're such sloppy drafters. I mean, who writes this stuff? This Department of Justice has probably a lot of people hanging their heads in shame that PMO is making them turn out such bad drafting, vague wording, sloppy work that's dangerous. I mean, what could be worse if you were a justice lawyer, you go to law school and you think you're going to do a good job for your country and you put out something that's dangerous garbage, which is what this is.
Tell us what you really feel about this, Elizabeth.
I feel so sorry for those lawyers.
Can I just ask you if there's any chance of oversight? Do you think that
No.
the Conservatives might even want, propose to bolster CERC or something?
It's a very funny story, I will tell you, because I've put in an amendment that is, in fact, a really good amendment for oversight. Full marks to Joyce Murray. We've put in her entire private member's bill for oversight as an amendment here. But I've already been told by sources that every single effort to improve oversight in this bill will be ruled out of order. They are going to take the position that since this bill isn't about oversight, we can't add oversight. Which is rather amusing considering that the Minister for Public Safety, Stephen Blaney, testified to committee this bill involves stronger judicial oversight. Well, he might think that will fool somebody, but the process of assessing whether our amendments are within the scope of the bill, I've been told that all of our efforts to improve oversight will be viewed outside the scope of the bill because the bill is not about oversight.
Same for the Liberal oversight section?
It'll go for everybody try to do anything to improve oversight. I mean, unless they change their legal opinion on the drafting, but that's what I've been told.
I think we're